I want you to imagine, just for a second, standing next to a living creature that was already centuries old when the Roman Empire fell.
It really is hard to even wrap your mind around.
It is, because you are looking at a being that experiences a complete human lifetime. I mean, everything you will ever do, everyone you will ever meet, every single anxiety you will ever have as nothing more than a brief season, like just a passing weather front.
Right, it completely dismantles our typical human-centric view of reality. When you stand next to an organism operating on that kind of timeline, it makes the frantic pace of our modern lives feel incredibly fragile, almost absurd, honest.
Absurd is the perfect word for it. I mean, we spend our days obsessing over quarter-by-quarter profits, answering emails, sitting in traffic, just entirely consumed by the immediate present.
Oh, absolutely.
But the core thesis we pulled from the sources for today's deep dive, it offers a radical counter-argument to all of that. The premise is basically this: the redwood tree is what happens when life simply stops thinking in human timescales.
And that is exactly why this discussion matters to whoever's listening to this right now. Because you might be commuting to work or, doing the dishes and wondering why on earth you should care about the biology of a tree.
Right, like why this specific tree?
Exactly. And the reason is that understanding the redwood is really a shortcut to understanding deep time, profound ecological resilience, and our own deeply complicated place in the natural world. It forces a perspective shift that you can actually carry with you.
I am absolutely ready for that perspective shift. I really am. But to get to the philosophy, we have to start with the sheer physical reality.
We do, yeah.
Because when you actually look at the biological facts, like the physical mechanics of how these things exist, they sound entirely alien. Let's start with the basics, because I learned from our sources that redwood is actually a pretty broad, almost sloppy term.
It is, yeah. Redwood is just the popular umbrella term we use to describe three surviving giants from a very, very ancient lineage.
Okay, so break those down for me.
Well, first, you have the coast redwood. The scientific name is Sequoia sempervirens. And sempervirens literally translates from Latin to always living or evergreen.
Which is incredibly fitting.
Right, for reasons we will definitely get into.
Yeah.
But these are the trees clinging to the foggy coastline of Northern California and just a tiny sliver of Southern Oregon.
Got it. And then there is the second one, the giant sequoia, right? Sequoia dendron giganteum.
Yes, and they occupy a totally different environment. You won't find them anywhere near the coast. They only live in isolated, snowy groves high up on the western slopes of California's Sierra Nevada mountain range.
Okay, so coast versus mountains.
Exactly. Now, finally, the third member of the family is the dawn redwood, or Metasequoia glyptostroboides, which is native to central China and has a backstory that genuinely reads like a botanical thriller.
We are definitely going to get to that backstory because it totally blew my mind when I read the notes.
Yeah.
But I want to stick with the first two for a moment, the coast redwood and the giant sequoia, because the physical scale of these organisms just breaks the brain. Coast redwoods are the tallest trees on Earth. We are talking over 380 feet tall.
Just to put that 380 feet into perspective, I want you to imagine the Statue of Liberty. Now imagine a tree looking down on the Statue of Liberty.
That's insane.
It is. You are looking at a living, breathing organism that is the height of a 35-story office building.
And then you have the giant sequoia, which it doesn't win on height, but it wins on sheer unbelievable mass. They are the largest living things by volume on the entire planet.
Yes, our notes highlight the famous General Sherman tree in the Sierra Nevada. The trunk volume on that single tree pushes its estimated weight to over 6,000 tons.
Oh, for 6,000 tons. I mean, think about the physics of that. 6,000 tons is roughly the displacement weight of a naval destroyer.
Right.
But it isn't made of steel. It is a plant. It is an organism that built a 6,000-ton body out of sunlight, water, and atmospheric carbon.
Which is an absolute metabolic marvel when you really break it down.
Okay, let's unpack this because I have to stop you there. The physics are exactly what I get hung up on. How does a 380-foot or a 6,000-ton column of biological material even survive?
It's a great question.
Because to support that kind of impossible architecture, our sources detail some biological adaptations that sound basically like magic. The one that totally threw me was the fog drinking.
Oh, the fog drinking is incredible.
Right. Coast redwoods live in an area that actually gets very little summer rain. So to survive, the notes say they drink the sky. How does a tree drink the sky?
It comes down to overcoming the limits of basic fluid dynamics. In a normal tree, water is absorbed by the roots and pulled up through the trunk to the leaves.
Right, standard biology.
Exactly.
Hmm.
This happens through a process involving capillary action and transpiration. As water evaporates from the leaves, it creates a negative pressure, basically a vacuum that pulls more water up from the ground,
Like sucking water up through a straw.
precisely like a straw.
Yeah.
But there is a physical limit to that. Gravity is constantly pulling that water column down. When a tree gets to be about 300 feet tall, the tension on that column of water becomes so immense that the water molecules can literally snap apart. It's a phenomenon called cavitation.
Cavitation. Wait, so the water just breaks?
Yes, if a bubble of air forms in the vascular tissue because the tension was just too high, the whole plumbing system in that part of the tree fails.
So the tree is basically fighting a war against gravity, and at 300 feet, gravity starts winning.
Exactly, gravity starts winning.
Hmm.
So the coast redwood had to evolve a bypass mechanism
Mm-hmm.
because they live in that specific coastal zone where dense, wet marine fog rolls in from the Pacific Ocean almost every night during the dry summer. The canopy of the tree adapts.
Okay, adapts how?
Well, the needles at the very top of a 350-foot redwood are structurally different from the needles at the bottom. They have specialized pores called stomata that can absorb atmospheric moisture directly from the fog.
Wait, really? So the top of the tree just completely ignores the root system?
For a significant portion of its water needs during the dry season, yes. It bypasses that 300-foot upward climb entirely. It actively harvests the fog, taking in moisture directly through its needles and bark to hydrate the upper canopy.
That is just wild. A tree drinking clouds. But speaking of the roots, this was the other detail that made me question everything I thought I knew about botany.
Let me guess, the depth.
Yes, because if I am building a 35-story skyscraper, I have to dig a massive, incredibly deep foundation. You would assume a tree the size of a skyscraper facing heavy coastal winds would have a massive taproot drilling hundreds of feet into the bedrock.
You would assume that, yes.
But the sources explicitly state they don't. Their root systems are shockingly shallow, sometimes only 6 to 12 feet deep.
It seems like a catastrophic engineering failure waiting to happen, doesn't it?
It totally does.
A 350-foot lever arm catching a winter storm wind should theoretically rip a 6-foot root system right out of the soil.
So what is literally happening underground to stop that? Because I've heard the cheesy metaphors, the trees are holding hands in a hurricane. Right. But that doesn't explain the actual mechanics. What is actually preventing a 6,000-ton tree from just tipping over in the mud?
The holding hands metaphor is poetic, but it really understates the physical reality. It's less like holding hands and more like a subterranean Kevlar mesh.
Kevlar mesh. Okay, I like that better.
A single redwood's root system might only go down 10 feet, but it can spread outward for 100 feet or more. And when those roots encounter the roots of a neighboring redwood, they don't just pass by each other. They physically intertwine, and in many cases, they graft together.
Graft together, like they actually fuse their vascular systems.
Yes. The living tissue of one tree merges with the tissue of another. And beyond the physical wood, these roots are intimately bound together by vast mycorrhizal fungal networks.
The fungal networks, right?
Exactly. Fungi that act as a microscopic subterranean internet, basically fusing the entire root zone into a single cohesive mat.
So if a massive gust of wind hits one tree at the edge of the grove,
the kinetic energy of that wind isn't just absorbed by that single tree's 10-foot root system. The sheer force is distributed across the entire underground mat, dispersed among dozens or even hundreds of surrounding trees.
Wow. It fundamentally upends how we typically picture strength,
It really does.
We usually idolize the lone, isolated pillar of strength, like the individual standing tall against the elements. But the biology of the redwood dictates that true strength is a distributed network.
Very well put.
A single redwood standing totally isolated in a field with a 6-foot root system would easily blow over. It only achieves its towering, seemingly independent height through total, absolute subterranean interdependence.
And that interdependence extends into how they reproduce, too. Which brings us to another concept from the sources that challenges our definition of an individual clonal reproduction.
Oh, yes. The fairy rings. Let's break this down. The notes explain that if a coast redwood is severely damaged, say it's struck by lightning, burned, or even chopped down by a logger, that isn't necessarily the end of the organism.
Far from it, actually. Redwoods have specialized knobby growths at the base of their trunks and along their roots called burls.
Burls, right. I've seen those on tables and things.
Exactly. And these burls are completely packed with dormant buds. If the main trunk dies or experiences severe trauma, the root system senses the loss of the canopy and immediately activates those dormant buds.
So it just hits the emergency restart button.
Exactly. New sprouts shoot up from the stump or the surrounding roots.
And because they are sprouting from the exact same root system, these new trees are genetically identical to the parent tree. They are literally clones.
Exactly. Over centuries, the original stump in the center rots away, and you are left with a perfect circle of massive trees, a fairy ring, all sharing the exact same DNA, all drawing from the exact same ancient root network.
So wait, when I am walking through a redwood grove, I might look at a tree that appears to be, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years old. But genetically, that specific continuous organism might have been occupying that exact patch of soil, endlessly regenerating itself for 10,000, maybe 20,000 years.
Yes, it really forces you to ask what constitutes the lifespan of a redwood. Is it the age of the current trunk, or the age of the continuous genetic line that has never technically died?
It's biological immortality, essentially. And what's strange is that usually in the plant kingdom, if something lives an incredibly long time, it grows painstakingly slowly.
Like a bristlecone pine.
Exactly. Like a bristlecone pine up in the mountains, it might live 4,000 years, but it grows a fraction of an inch a decade. But our sources say redwoods break that rule completely.
They absolutely shatter it. Despite their multi-millennial lifespans, redwoods are some of the fastest-growing trees on Earth. In ideal conditions, a young coast redwood can shoot up 3 to 10 feet in a single year.
10 feet a year, that's the aggressive, rapid growth rate of like a pioneer weed, but grafted onto the lifespan of a geological monument.
It's an unbelievable synergy of traits. Extreme height, massive volume, shallow communal roots, clonal immortality, and rapid growth. You simply do not find that combination together anywhere else in botany.
Which brings up a really important realization. These bizarre physical adaptations, the fog drinking, the chronal burls, the massive scale, they seem almost alien to the environments we live in today.
They do.
And our sources make it completely clear why. They weren't built for the Earth we live on today. To understand them, we have to look at when they actually evolved.
Right. If you trace the genetic and fossil lineage of the redwood, you have to leave the modern era entirely. You are traveling deep into the Mesozoic era.
The Mesozoic era.
Yes. Recognizable ancestors of the modern redwood were thriving around 200 million years ago.
Let me just pause and ground that number for a second. 200 million years ago.
Yeah.
That's the age of the dinosaurs. These trees are older than modern mammals.
They are.
They're older than grasses. I had to read that sentence in our notes twice. Imagine an Earth with no grass. They are older than most flowering plants.
The botanical term for them is gymnosperm, which means naked seed. Before plants evolved flowers and enclosed fruits, which are called angiosperms, the world was dominated by gymnosperms like conifers, cycads, and ginkgos.
So this was a completely different planet, essentially.
Completely. When the redwood blueprint was being drawn up by evolution, the world was incredibly humid, thick with giant ferns, and utterly dominated by massive reptiles and these towering cone-bearing trees.
And our sources point out that during those warmer, ancient geological periods, redwoods weren't just huddled on the coast of California. They were literally everywhere.
They formed vast global forest systems. Paleobotanists refer to this as the Arcto-Tertiary geoflora.
Arcto-Tertiary geoflora. Sounds heavy.
Right. Arcto meaning northern, and tertiary referring to the geological period. Across North America, Europe, and Asia, redwood relatives were the dominant canopy trees. They were a truly global empire.
But if you look at a map of their distribution today, they are restricted to these incredibly tiny, narrow slivers of land on the West Coast, plus that one spot in China. So they went from owning the entire northern hemisphere to occupying a few scattered zip codes. Why? What wiped out the global empire?
The climate changed. Over millions of years, the Earth entered a cooling phase. The ice ages rolled in, glaciers expanded, and continental climates dried out significantly.
And redwoods need water.
They require immense amounts of water, yes. And they have very little defense against deep, prolonged, bone-chilling freezes.
So they basically couldn't survive the New World Order.
They couldn't. As the continents dried and froze, the vast Arcto-Tertiary forests died off. The terminology the notes use for the surviving redwoods is paleoendemic.
Paleoendemic, let's break that down.
Endemic means native and restricted to a certain place, and paleo means ancient. They were the ancient survivors of a lost world. They didn't adapt to the new, colder, drier Earth. They just retreated.
Like an army falling back.
Precisely. They fell back into very narrow, specialized climatic refuges where the ancient conditions still barely held on.
So the coastal fog belt provided just enough moisture and temperature moderation for the coast redwood. And the specific elevation of the Sierra Nevada slopes provided just enough seasonal meltwater without lethal freezes for the giant sequoia.
What's fascinating here is the profound ecological lesson. In evolutionary biology, we are often taught to equate success with aggressive expansion. Spreading everywhere, adapting to every new environment.
Right, the survival of the fittest, conquering the globe.
But the redwood proves that survival doesn't always require conquering new territory. Sometimes survival simply means finding one last ridge or one last foggy valley and just holding your ground for 2 million years.
And the most cinematic proof of that holding out strategy has to be the story of the Dawn Redwood. I promised we would get to this earlier, and it is honestly straight out of an adventure novel.
It really is.
For the longest time, Western science only knew about the Dawn Redwood from fossils.
It was considered a botanical ghost. Paleobotanists had found its fossilized needles scattered across the northern hemisphere, and they universally assumed it had gone extinct millions of years ago.
Wiped out with the dinosaurs.
Exactly. Wiped out in the same extinction event that killed the dinosaurs. It was a completely closed book.
Until the 1940s. Right in the middle of the 20th century, a Chinese forester is surveying a remote mountainous valley in central China.
And he finds a living tree.
A living tree that the locals had just been casually using in their village.
When the samples finally made their way to botanists who could formally identify them, it sent a shockwave through the scientific community. It was a completely lost species, presumed dead for millions of years, just quietly growing in a secluded valley.
I mean, it is the biological equivalent of walking into a remote canyon and finding a living triceratops grazing by a stream.
That's a perfect analogy.
It is a testament to the unbelievable resilience of this lineage. These trees survived asteroid impacts. They survived the massive shifting of tectonic plates. They survived multiple ice ages, and they survived the dinosaurs.
Which really sets up what is arguably the most jarring and tragic transition in our entire deep dive.
Yeah, this part is heavy.
Because after surviving millions of years of profound geological and climatological chaos, they finally met human industry.
And the collision of those two timelines is just brutal. We have been speaking in timescales of millions of years, or individual trees quietly standing in one spot for 3,000 years.
Right.
And then, in a historical blink of an eye, the Industrial Revolution arrives on the west coast of North America.
Though, to be strictly accurate with the history laid out in our sources, the collision wasn't with all humanity. We really have to draw a distinct line between industrial society and the indigenous peoples who had been living within these redwood ecosystems for millennia.
Absolutely. That's a crucial distinction. The notes go into great detail about the indigenous tribes of the region. The Yurok, the Tolowa, the Hupa, the Karuk, they had lived among the coast redwoods for thousands of years. And their relationship with the forest was fundamentally different from what the 19th century loggers brought.
The key difference was the worldview. To these tribes, the redwood was not merely a raw material. It was viewed as a sacred living relative. A guardian spirit of the landscape.
No, they absolutely utilized the wood, right? They didn't just look at it.
Oh, definitely. They built magnificent, massive plank houses and beautifully carved dugout canoes that could navigate the turbulent coastal rivers and even the ocean.
Redwood is perfect for a canoe because it naturally resists rot. But the crucial distinction our sources make is how they harvested the wood. It was a relationship based on reciprocity.
Right. Indigenous utilization relied heavily on fallen logs. A 300-foot tree falls over in winter storm, and that single log provides enough material to sustain a village's building needs for years.
So they aren't clear-cutting?
Not at all. They used elk horn wedges to split the straight-grained wood directly off the fallen trunk. They also utilized driftwood that washed down the rivers onto the beaches. They had a deeply ingrained ecological knowledge and the cultural restraint to utilize the gifts of the tree without liquidating the standing forest.
The tree was a provider, a member of the community. But then, the 1800s arrive, the California gold rush explodes.
And everything changes overnight.
Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of settlers are flooding into the region. They need to build instant cities like San Francisco. They need mining infrastructure, flumes, sluice boxes.
And they look at these 2,000-year-old, 300-foot-tall biological ruins, and they don't see a sacred relative. They see an incredibly convenient, massive stockpile of lumber.
And we have to look at the mechanics of the wood to understand why they targeted it so aggressively. Redwood is practically a miracle material for a rapidly expanding industrial society.
Walk me through that. Why was it so valuable compared to, say, pine or oak?
Well, first, it has a phenomenally straight grain, which makes it very easy to mill into perfectly straight boards. It is surprisingly lightweight, yet incredibly strong. But the most important factor is its chemistry.
It's chemistry, yes.
Redwood is packed with complex chemical compounds called tannins.
Tannins, like in wine or tea. It's exactly like in wine or tea. Tannins are polyphenolic compounds that plants use as a defense mechanism. They taste intensely bitter to insects, repelling termites and beetles.
Oh, wow.
More importantly, they act as a natural preservative, making the wood highly resistant to fungal decay and rot. A redwood log can lie on the damp forest floor for a century and remain completely structurally sound inside.
So it was the ultimate building material for a wet, expanding frontier. It basically became the physical infrastructure of modern California.
It really did.
The notes say we are talking about the railroad ties that laid the tracks connecting the West. We're talking about the water tanks that held the plumbing for expanding cities, the shingles on the roofs of Victorian homes in San Francisco, even the stakes holding up the grapevines in Napa Valley.
The very bones of West Coast industrial expansion were carved directly out of ancient, irreplaceable ecosystems.
And the math of this extraction is just staggering. Our sources highlight that by the 20th century, roughly 95% of the original old-growth coast redwood forests had been logged.
95%.
Think about what that actually means. An ecosystem that took millions of years to evolve, featuring individual groves that had stood completely undisturbed since the Roman Empire, was practically erased in a handful of human generations.
It represents a profound psychological and spiritual shift. When the industrial mindset encountered the redwood, it encountered a scale of time and physical mass that it simply could not process.
It was too big to comprehend.
Right. And in the face of that overwhelming ancient awe, rather than bowing to it, the industrial society chose to dominate it economically. It converted a relationship into an inventory.
And the stories of that extraction are filled with these incredibly dark, tragic ironies. For example, we mentioned how the wood is packed with tannins and is incredibly durable.
Yes.
Well, the giant sequoias up in the mountains are famously fire resistant. Their bark can be up to 2 feet thick, acting as a massive layer of asbestos to protect them from wildfires. And yet early loggers actually cut down fire-resistant coast redwoods just to burn them as fuel in industrial lime kilns.
It was a complete misallocation of a biological masterpiece. And the logging of the giant sequoias themselves was perhaps the darkest irony of all.
Why is that?
Because the wood of the giant sequoia, unlike the coast redwood, is actually quite brittle. It snaps very easily.
So why even cut them down if the wood is brittle?
Pure hubris and blind momentum. Logging companies would build massive scaffolding called springboards around a tree that was 100 feet in circumference. Men would spend days, sometimes weeks, manually pulling a cross-cut misery whip saw through the trunk.
Sweating for weeks to fell a single living thing.
Exactly. And when the tree finally fell, hitting the ground with the force of a localized earthquake, its own massive weight and the brittleness of the wood would cause the entire 2,000-year-old monument to shatter upon impact.
Just shatter.
It would shatter into millions of useless splinters.
They destroyed a 2-millennia-old titan, an organism that had survived the Dark Ages. Just to watch it turn into matchsticks, it's horrifying.
It really is.
But knowing that 95% was lost, the obvious question is, how did this unprecedented destruction actually get stopped? Because the shift away from pure extraction is what essentially birthed the modern environmental movement.
The turning point was a moral awakening, and it was triggered directly by the visual horror of the clear cuts. People started visiting the remaining groves. They saw the massive, shattered stumps.
The aftermath of it all?
Right. They saw the barren, eroding hillsides where lush, dripping canopy used to be. And a profound sense of cultural guilt began to take hold. This culminated in a pivotal historical moment in 1890 with the creation of Sequoia National Park.
And our sources made a specific point to highlight that this wasn't just another park. This was a massive philosophical shift in American conservation.
It was a historical first. Before 1890, parks like Yellowstone or Yosemite were created to protect a landscape. You know, the dramatic geysers, the deep canyons, the scenic vistas.
The pretty views.
Exactly. But Sequoia National Park was the first time in human history that a national piece of land was set aside specifically to protect a living organism. The giant tree itself became the monument. It fundamentally expanded the legal and cultural idea of what deserved protection.
It essentially changed American conservation politics forever, but the notes also make a really astute observation about the economics of the tree.
Oh, the shift in extraction.
Exactly. The establishment of parks didn't remove the redwood from the economy, it just changed the type of extraction. We shifted from resource extraction to experience extraction.
That's a great way to put it. We went from cutting them down to make railroad ties to putting fences around them and charging admission. We started selling the imagery of them.
Right, they became backdrops for car commercials, destinations for spiritual retreats, and symbols on social media.
The redwood is still generating massive economic value, but now it's emotional, aesthetic, and touristic value.
Which brings us right into the current, very complex debates about what to do with the redwoods that are left and the land where they used to grow.
It's a very heated debate today.
It is, because our sources impartially lay out that this isn't a simple good guys versus bad guys scenario anymore. There's an ongoing, legitimate debate between the logging industry and preservationists regarding second growth forests.
It's important to look at both sides impartially here. On one side, the timber industry has a very practical argument. Redwood is an incredibly durable, beautiful, and highly sought-after material.
And people still want to build with it.
Exactly. They argue that if we manage second-growth forests, the trees that grew back after the initial clear-cuts responsibly, it provides vital jobs for rural communities. Furthermore, using locally sourced wood is actually a much lower carbon building material compared to manufacturing concrete or smelting steel.
Right. If you have to build a house, wood is a renewable resource, whereas concrete is a massive carbon emitter.
That's their main point, yes.
But on the other side of the debate, conservationists argue that while a second-growth timber farm might be better than a concrete factory, it is absolutely not a replacement for an old-growth ecosystem. They argue that an ancient forest is an irreplaceable biodiversity bank.
And that leads perfectly into the modern threats facing the trees. Because the debate over chainsaws is almost becoming secondary to a much larger issue, the climate itself is changing again.
Let's look at the coast redwoods first. We established earlier that they survive the dry summers by drinking the marine fog. But our notes highlight that climate change is actively disrupting that fog cycle.
Yes. As global temperatures rise, coastal waters warm, and atmospheric pressure patterns shift. The delicate marine layer that brings the fog is becoming much less predictable and less dense.
So the fog is literally disappearing.
In many areas, yes.
Yeah.
And if that fog disappears, the trees lose their bypass mechanism. They can't pull water 350 feet up from the soil during a severe drought. They will literally begin to dry out and die from the top down.
That is absolutely terrifying. But the threat to the giant sequoia up in the mountains is even more paradoxical, and honestly, it's our own fault.
It really is.
We learned earlier that giant sequoias are incredibly fire-resistant, but the sources reveal something even crazier. They don't just resist fire, they actually need fire to survive and reproduce.
It's a biological trait called serotiny. The codes of the giant sequoia are sealed tight with a tough resin. They can hang on the tree for decades, totally closed. They evolved to wait for a regular low-intensity wildfire to sweep through the underbrush.
So the fire comes through, burns away all the competing brush and dead leaves.
Right, creating a bed of bare, nutrient-rich mineral ash. And the heat from that fire rises into the canopy, melting the resin on the cones. The cones pop open, and thousands of seeds rain down into the perfect, freshly cleared nursery bed below.
So the tree actively requires a controlled level of destruction to continue its lineage.
It is deeply dependent on fire, yes.
So if they need fire, and they have 2-foot-thick fireproof bark, what went wrong? Why are modern fires suddenly killing thousands of these ancient sequoias?
Because of human intervention. For the last 100 years, the dominant forest management policy in the United States was absolute fire suppression. Smokey Bear.
Put out every fire immediately.
Exactly. Every time a natural lightning strike fire started, we rushed in and put it out. We thought we were being good stewards, saving the trees.
We thought we were protecting them.
We did. But what we actually did was disrupt their natural cycle. By putting out every small fire, we allowed a century's worth of dead wood, dry underbrush, and highly flammable, younger, shade-tolerant trees to pile up on the forest floor. We accidentally created a massive stockpile of kindling.
The forestry term for this is ladder fuels, right?
Exactly. Ladder fuels. When a fire starts today, especially during a climate-driven mega drought, it doesn't stay low to the ground like it used to. It catches all that accumulated underbrush, and it climbs that ladder of smaller trees right up into the massive canopy of the ancient sequoias.
So it bypasses their thick protective bark entirely, and burns them where they are vulnerable.
Yes, these modern megafires are burning so hot and reaching so high into the canopy that they completely exceed the evolutionary tolerances of the sequoias. The heat literally cooks the needles and boils the sap.
Boiling the sap inside the tree? That's horrifying.
In recent years, we have seen massive, unprecedented mortality events. Thousands of 2,000-year-old trees dying in single fire seasons.
We tried to control nature too completely, we ignored the biology of the organism, and we accidentally built a bomb underneath the oldest living things on the continent.
It's a profound tragedy of well-intentioned mismanagement.
But I want to circle back to the logging debate for a second because it ties into this idea of complex ecosystems. Let's say a timber company logs a patch of second-growth forest, and to mitigate the impact, they plant thousands of new redwood saplings in neat little rows.
Okay.
Is planting a new redwood plantation actually replacing the forest we cut down?
Not even close. And understanding the mechanics of why is absolutely crucial. A second-growth timber farm where trees are planted uniformly and harvested every 50 to 80 years is an agricultural crop. It is a farm.
Right.
An old-growth redwood ecosystem is an entirely different world.
So break down the mechanics of that world for me. What is an old-growth tree doing that a 50-year-old tree isn't?
It's all about structural complexity. When a coast redwood lives for 1,000 or 2,000 years, its canopy becomes incredibly massive and irregular. High up in the branches, massive forks and deep crevices develop. Over centuries, falling needles, dust, and organic debris get caught in those massive branch crotches.
Okay, so it collects junk up there.
Yes, but as that material decays, it literally creates soil.
Wait, I need to make sure I'm hearing you right. Are you saying there is actual dirt, like soil, floating in the sky?
Literally.
Yeah.
It is called suspended soil.
Yeah.
You have pockets of rich, developed soil resting on branches 200 or 300 feet in the air.
That is insane.
And in that aerial soil, entire miniature ecosystems take hold. Epiphytic ferns grow up there. Mosses thrive. There are entire populations of the wandering salamander that live their entire lives up in the canopy, hunting insects in the suspended soil, never once touching the actual ground below.
Never touching the ground.
The tree even sends out adventitious roots from its own branches into this suspended soil, effectively drinking from its own canopy compost.
That is staggering. It is a world layered upon a world.
And you simply cannot recreate that on a human timeline. You can plant a sapling today, and it will provide wood in 60 years, sure. But you cannot quickly manufacture biological memory.
Right, you can't fast forward time.
Exactly. You cannot plant a sapling and magically replace 2 millennia of ecological architecture, suspended soil, and subterranean fungal internet.
And I think that profound complexity is why encountering an old-growth ecosystem fundamentally changes us. When you walk from a uniform planted timber farm into a virgin ancient redwood grove, your physical behavior changes, which transitions us into the final and perhaps the most profound section of our notes, the psychological and philosophical impact of the trees.
It is a documented phenomenon. Even the most secular, cynical, busy modern person tends to physically alter their posture when they step into a virgin redwood grove.
It is uncanny. I've felt it myself. The sources point out how human beings almost universally instinctively reach for religious language to describe these spaces.
We do.
We don't just call them forests, we call them cathedrals, we call them sanctuaries or holy groves. Why do we do that? Biologically speaking, it's just a plant. But the redwood seems to weaponize our own evolutionary psychology against us. It triggers an overwhelming sense of awe.
It's fascinating to look at the mechanics of that awe. Human beings evolved to feel a very specific set of emotions when confronted with something vastly larger and older than ourselves.
Which the redwood definitely is.
Right. Extreme height visually triggers a sense of physical humility. It forces us to physically tilt our heads up, which is a universal human posture of reverence and submission. Extreme age triggers an instinctual psychological association with wisdom and permanence. The redwoods exaggerate every single psychological trigger we associate with transcendence.
They're like giant biological mirrors. The notes suggest that the tree essentially reflects human moral development back at us. We walk in, we look at its towering height, and we see our own ambition.
Yes.
We look at its unfathomable age, and we see our deep existential grief over our own incredibly short lifespans. We look at the massive, shattered stumps left by the loggers, and we see our terrifying capacity for greed. And then we look at the protected parks, the fences keeping them safe, and we see our capacity for stewardship.
It forces us to confront exactly who we are.
And if we are willing to learn from them, they offer a completely different philosophy of what it means to be successful. In our modern human culture, success is almost always equated with aggressive conquest.
Moving fast, disrupting the environment, outcompeting everyone around you to climb to the top.
But the redwood achieves immense, unparalleled scale simply through a philosophy of extreme slowness.
It doesn't loudly conquer. It just quietly persists.
Exactly. It grows patiently. It doesn't aggressively invade new territory. It just outlasts the competition. And as we discussed with the intertwined root systems, it achieves its towering individual height, not through isolated dominance, but through absolute communal support.
And we can't forget the physical trauma either. So many of these ancient giants have massive, hollowed-out black cavities at their base, burned scars from fires that swept through hundreds of years ago.
You can literally stand inside the charred wound of the tree.
You can. But you look up, and the tree is still alive, still putting out bright green needles 300 feet in the air.
They don't survive by remaining untouched by the world. They survive because they bear scars. They integrate the trauma into their architecture. The burn cavity simply becomes part of the physical structure that supports the next 1,000 years of growth.
That is an incredibly profound metaphor for human resilience. We often think of trauma or damage as an endpoint, a permanent failure. The redwood shows that damage is just a localized event on a much longer timeline.
So what does this all mean? When you, listening to this right now, finally take that trip and walk into a redwood grove, you will probably notice that you instinctively lower your voice to a whisper.
You do it because the presence of the tree demands it.
It forces you into redwood time. How can we apply that to our everyday lives?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the redwood proves that true, lasting greatness isn't loud, it isn't fast, it isn't hyper-individualistic. The most magnificent, successful living structures on our planet are incredibly slow, deeply rooted, and entirely collective.
I love that.
The next time you feel overwhelmed by the frantic 247 pace of the modern world, by the endless barrage of notifications and the crushing pressure to produce instantly,
Okay.
I want you to picture the silent, ancient persistence of a redwood tree. Picture an organism that watched the Roman Empire fall and is still just quietly drinking the fog.
It completely alters how you view your own temporary anxieties. Your stress about a deadline seems pretty small when compared to a 3,000-year life cycle. Just to recap this incredible journey we've been on, we started with a prehistoric survivor, a literal biological ruin, echoing a Jurassic gymnosperm-dominated Earth.
Well, we did.
We saw it become the tragic victim of an insatiable industrial appetite that quickly erased 95% of its ancient world to build railroads and water tanks. And now it stands as a complex modern symbol, a climate machine, an endangered giant threatened by the very fires it needs, and a living testament to deep time.
It is a humbling reminder that humanity is just a brief event in the life of the forest, not the other way around.
A passing season.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. It builds on what we just discussed, but it looks forward instead of backward. We talked extensively about those fire scars, how the redwoods carry the physical charred marks of centuries-old lightning strikes and indigenous burns deep inside their massive trunks. It is a biological record of history. Well, given that these trees routinely outlast entire human empires, what will the next civilization, the one that wanders into these surviving groves thousands of years from now, what will they learn about us?
Oh, wow.
What story is being told by the chainsaw marks, the modern megafire burn scars, and the altered growth rings from climate change that we are etching into their bark today?
That is a haunting thought, a physical record of our current choices, outliving us by millennia.
Something to think about the next time you look at a piece of wooden patio furniture or step into a forest. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and try to find a little bit of redwood time in your own life today.